Hello, everyone. I am Yang Jian Li, founder and president of Citizen Power Initiatives for China. It is such an honor to host this virtual commemoration of the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen Massacre, together with the Tom Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, Victims of a Communist Memorial Foundation, and Athena Institute. Since last night, our main operating computer have been crashed a few times. The causes are not yet to be known. So it is not unlikely that we will receive attacks during this meeting. So if anything like that happens, we will try to reboot the computer. That may take 2 to 3 minutes. So be patient and wait. If the problem recurs, please get on our website, citizenpowerforchina.org, citizenpowerforchina.org for notice regarding how we proceed. Welcome you all. Today, June 4th, marks the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen Massacre, in which thousands of civilians were brutally murdered by the Chinese Communist Party's death squads. Their only crime was calling for clean government, freedom, and democracy. 32 years have passed. Despite the passage of time, this page of history has yet to be turned because justice has never been served. On the contrary, the Chinese government continues to commit atrocity after atrocity, largely with impunities. As survivors, we commemorate the Tiananmen Massacre not only as a memorial for the victims, but more importantly, as recognition of the continued struggle. In the face of the world's most powerful dictatorship, fighting for freedom and justice is like the tank man standing in front of a convoy of tanks. It takes unparalleled courage and sacrifice. Today, we have two such heroes join us in commemorating the Tiananmen Massacre, Mr. Wang Xilin and Professor Cai Xia. In 1989, Mr. Wang Xilin, one of China's most prestigious composers, joined the students in Tiananmen Square and delivered passionate speeches in support of the protests. With other Beijing residents, he helped block military vehicles from entering the city during the crackdown and risked his own life to rescue students. After the massacre, Mr. Wang devoted himself to the creation of the Third Symphony, a music homage to heroes of Tiananmen Square. With each music note, Mr. Wang has immortalized the souls lost to the cause of democracy and freedom in Tiananmen Square. Today, we will use Mr. Wang's music to pay tribute to the martyrs of Tiananmen Square. Professor Cai Xia, who will converse with Mr. Wang today in our program, was a party insider for many years. She has been advocating constitutional democracy from within. Since Xi Jinping came to power and cracked down on any dissent, she was among the very few in China who dared to stand up and speak out against Xi's reverting to the Maoist era. Because of her outspokenness, Beijing expelled her from the party and cut off all her pension benefits. But Professor Cai Xia continues her criticism with unyielding courage. Let this commemorating event and these two heroes help us recommit our values and beliefs and reconnect what we say we believe with what we do. Justice must be served. This is our shared calling and commitment. Now let me invite my co-host to give opening remarks. First, Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat. She is the president of Tom Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. Katrina, please.
Good morning, friends. It seems almost inconceivable that we are gathering today to remember the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. It's inconceivable because the massacre remains so fresh in the minds of those of us who watched the unfolding tragedy from afar. It is even more inconceivable for those who lived through that terrible time and who carry the burden of it with them always. And finally, it is inconceivable that 32 years after the brutal repression of a peaceful movement for democracy and human rights, that China has become an even more repressive, totalitarian surveillance state, one which seeks to export its brand of authoritarianism around the world and flaunts its outrageous violation of international law, from its strangulation of rule of law and democracy in Hong Kong to its ongoing suppression of Tibet, and of course the genocide of the Uyghur community of Xinjiang. Under such disheartening circumstances, it can be tempting to give up, to lose hope, but that is the one thing we must never do. The brave legacy of those who sacrificed everything at Tiananmen Square demands that we neither tire nor grow weary in seeking to advance the cause for which they gave, in Lincoln's words, their last full measure of devotion. This year, Citizen Power Initiatives for China will be remembering and honoring the heroes of Tiananmen Square in an unforgettable way. Together, we will be participating in an online concert featuring Wang Jilin's Symphony No. 3. Mr. Wang is a renowned composer, but this particular piece of music springs from his own searing experiences in a forced labor camp, enduring brutal beatings, and of course, what he witnessed as a participant in the Tiananmen protests. His music speaks to the sorrow and the pity, the hope and the determination of those who stay in the fight for a China that is free and democratic. It is fitting that Tiananmen should be remembered this year through the medium of music. In 1989, one of the most famous and iconic pieces of music played a powerful role in encouraging the protesters in Tiananmen Square. As troops began assembling, preparing soon to crush the young democracy activists, makeshift loudspeakers were rigged up by some of the students, over which they played Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. With borrowed car batteries and brave hearts, they sang the Ode to Joy. One of the leaders of the protest, Feng Congde, said that singing those magnificent bars of music in the face of the threatening tanks and troops somehow connected each of them individually and as a united group. In his words, and I quote, "We use the ninth to create an ambiance of solidarity and hope for ourselves and for the people of China." In this battle of democracy versus dictatorship and despots versus dignity, the protesters had no weapons that could match their oppressors. But in the battle of voices, of those speaking truth versus those speaking lies, they were, for a moment, triumphant over their foes. Again, in the words of Feng, "I put on the cassette of Beethoven's Ninth to cover the voice of the government system." So there was a real battle for voice. Hundreds of thousands of students shouting as we broadcast the music on the square louder than the government system. I had a feeling of triumph. We finally regained our dignity as human beings. The Tiananmen Square heroes lost the immediate battle that day, but one day, if we stay faithful to them and to their sacrifice, they will win the final battle. My late father, Congressman Tom Lantos, himself a refugee from communist dictatorships, used to say that the dictators would one day be consigned to the dustbin of history, while those who dared to stand up for freedom would be crowned with laurels and honored for their courage. Today we are honoring and remembering those heroes through the music of Wang Jilin. Let us hold fast to our ideals. Let us hold fast to our hope that in time, the sacrifice of those who died and suffered at Tiananmen Square will be redeemed and rewarded. And let us be lifted to a stronger and braver place by the music we will hear today. In the words of Henry David Thoreau, quote, "When I hear music, I fear no danger. I am invulnerable. I see no foe." May God bless us all to find the strength that music can give us to meet the battles ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina, for such a touching speech. On this day, we also remember your beloved father, Congressman Tom Lantos. He was such a leader, so many people are missing. And he was true human rights champion. And the world needs a leaders like him now more than ever. Thank you, Katrina. Now let's welcome Ambassador Andrew Bremberg, President of Victims of a Communist Memorial Foundation. Ambassador, please.
Thank you, John Lee. And we at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation are proud and honored to co-host this event with you today. And thank you for joining us last night at our candlelight vigil. Tiananmen means gates of the heavenly peace, but it was on this day 32 years ago that those heavenly gates witnessed the wholesale slaughter of countless people by their own government. For the free world, 1989 is frequently remembered as the year of miracles, where the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union began to crumble. But in China, it showed the brutal lengths the Chinese Communist Party was willing to go in slaughtering its own citizens to preserve its own power. What was the crime these brave Chinese citizens committed? They demanded that their government allow them freedoms that we in the free world take for granted every day: a free press, government accountability, and genuine representation. We are still living in the aftermath of that fateful night in June 1989. And it is for this reason that we still commemorate this appalling tragedy today. We also commemorate those who suffered countless acts of violence carried out across China that day, in places where there were no journalists to record and bring to light the atrocities committed in the name of communism. Today, we stand in solidarity with the millions across China who were impacted by that event and continue to suffer in silence at the hands of an all-encompassing power of the regime. We also stand in solidarity with the people of Hong Kong, who until recently were the only people in all of China who could commemorate that day's events free from state repression. In 1989, more than 1 million Hong Kongers marched in solidarity with the protesters in Tiananmen Square, and since then have mourned those that lost their lives during an annual vigil in Victoria Park. But this will be the first year no such vigil will take place now that the CCP has snuffed out any dissent to their one-party rule. Finally, we stand in solidarity with the millions suffering across China today, from the Uyghur, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and Tajik people who are being subjected to the CCP's genocide, to those suffering in Tibet, to the countless millions who desire basic human dignity, and to the people of Taiwan, whose freedom is threatened every day. As we meet today to bear witness to the truth, we know that any mention of the massacre will be erased in the country where it happened. This is why it is so important for us to come together and honor those who continue to educate the future generations about what took place. Few have been as important in carrying out that spirit of those days than the Tiananmen mothers. This group of mothers who educate the public about what their children experience and demand nothing but transparency and accountability from their government are examples of how citizens can have a major impact. For the regime in Beijing, the Tiananmen mothers represent an existential threat to their totalitarian rule. But to us, they are an inspiration. And that is why the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation awarded them our Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom. I want to thank all of you for standing with us today to remember those that were lost and to stand for those who are the victims of the most brutal communist regime on earth today. We will all continue to come together every year, and we look forward to the day when the Tiananmen Square massacre is commemorated where it happened and its victims are finally given justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bremberg, for your powerful message. Our profound gratitude to you and your wonderful team at VOC for your wonderful job and unwavering support. Thank you so much. I'm always encouraged by committed young leaders. Our next host is Mr. Rory O'Connor. He is a college student, president of Athena Institute. Rory, please.
Dr. Yang, thank you. To begin, hello and good morning to all who are here. I'm glad that you are all able to join us on a day as solemn as this, and I'd like to first address my fellow co-hosts, Ambassador Bremberg, Dr. Lantos Sweat. It's a pleasure to have you both here. With that in mind, I would also like to express my thanks to those who will be speaking afterwards and giving remarks from various communities and backgrounds and from various areas and walks of life. But with that in mind, above all else, I want to express not only my deep indebtedness and that of Athena and that of so many students across the country, but at the very least acknowledge the nameless, but the many brave students, faculty members, classmates, just normal people who at oftentimes great personal risk to themselves spoke out in the United States to make the work of Athena possible and allow for some of our efforts. But with that in mind, we're here today ultimately because of the efforts of students and young people, just like you and me 32 years ago, who with a sense of dignity and responsibility sought only to have access to what by right ought to have been owed to them in the first place. And bear in mind, considering that these are the universal values and that we as Americans so often espouse and proclaim to defend and take for granted, it is with that in mind that it is all the more saddening that we know how Tiananmen ended. And it is with that in mind that I want to say, I will leave to others speaking about what exactly happened and what was done in the deeds of those who survived Tiananmen and those who passed and martyred themselves there. But I want to make very clear that in the 32 years since then, and as it is so obvious today, the situation with the Chinese Communist Party has, relative to 1989, deteriorated significantly from the perspective of the free world. The failure was never that of the dissidents, if you want to call them that, but the normal people, the citizens, the activists, the students, the folks who simply wanted to have the rights that were owed to them. It was our fault in 17 days after the massacre of untold thousands of students and workers and people who are simply trying to take a stand for what they should have had in the first place, 17 days after they martyred themselves. It was first the George H.W. Bush administration that started engaging in talks with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government about lifting sanctions and trying to get back on track economically, or in the economic relationship. And then later, and I am not trying to cast blame here, because fundamentally, the truth of this matter and of the past 30 years is integral to understanding where we are right now and how we can move forward. But it was only a few years later when President Bill Clinton, who after campaigning on continuing to link human rights to trade, ended up delinking human rights from trade. And with that, we began what was essentially and ultimately the subordination of human rights, of our belief in the dignity of the human person, of our belief in democracy, which is fundamentally posited on it, to commercial interests. It is with that in mind that everything else that followed was inevitable. Now, when there are young Chinese that are my age who have gone through patriotic education and have little to no knowledge, or have, I dare say, been brainwashed about events such as Tiananmen Square and what have you, who are simply in denial about these sorts of things, it's because we emboldened the plutocrats, the ruling elite, those that actually had power and those within the party. And we did so at the expense of ourselves in a large sense, but more than anything, we did it at the expense of Chinese self-determination. And I was grateful to see Secretary Blinken's statement last night, but what I want to discuss now is not just how we are going to verbally condemn the Chinese Communist Party, because practically everyone in the world in 1989 verbally condemned the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government and the PLA for the massacre in Tiananmen Square. But 32 years later, finding ourselves in the position in which we're in now, in which China is about to host an Olympic Games while they're committing an act of genocide, and while they're tightening and, I would say, inarguably more repressive and more totalitarian than they were in 1989, we have to start backing up what we're doing with action. And that begins as a student. And that's what I want to get into here. The role of students now it has nothing to do with broader political aspirations or a Cold War or great power competition. Fundamentally, it has to do with the rights and the corresponding obligations that we have as students, as scholars, as part of institutions that are committed to the pursuit of truth and the dissemination of it. As young people, it is our responsibility to, when others are silent, such as in China, one has only to read Viral Alarm or any number of essays or see how academic freedom has been removed from the charters of any number of different major universities in China. But the only way that we can actually that we can act in solidarity with the oppressed in China is by allowing space and supporting civil society in the United States, so that way we are not determining their future, but we are at least allowing space for them to do it on their own, in which there is space to discuss a future without the Communist Party involved. Nothing more, nothing less. And oftentimes self-definition is necessary in order to do that, which is why oftentimes Confucius Institutes are considered fundamentally incompatible with academic freedom and with the pursuit of truth that ostensibly public institutions ought to hold sacred. But with that in mind, if we are to actually have a meaningful distinction between the Chinese Communist Party, and I'll end on this, but between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people, it's only going to take place if we prevent the monopolization of China as an identity, as a people, as a history, as a culture, as a language outside of China, where we do not let the party become synonymous with the people, with the history, with the culture. And with that in mind, I just want to say I am again grateful to be here and to provide some insight on the role of students in not speaking over, but empowering and acting as an ally to those who are Chinese and what have you. With that, I thank you, Dr. Yang, and I thank the rest of the co-hosts and those who are giving remarks.
Thank you, Rory, for your insights. Today, we have lined up a host of wonderful speakers who are political and human rights leaders. I don't think any of them needs much introduction. We are particularly honored and encouraged to have Madam Speaker Nancy Pelosi with us.
As House Speaker, on behalf of the United States House of Representatives, it is my solemn honor to join distinguished leaders around the world for this Tiananmen Remembrance Concert. Today, we take time to remember the brutal massacre that the Chinese government committed against its own people 32 years ago. We remember the courage of the students, workers, and citizens who peacefully defied an oppressive regime to demand their rights. We remember how the tanks and troops crushed their protests but could not extinguish the flame of freedom that burned in their hearts. It is exactly that same fierce spirit of resilience and strength that is embodied in Wang Zilin's haunting Symphony No. 3. This extraordinary piece of music reminds us of our responsibility to the heroes of June 4th to remember their sacrifice and to keep alive their fight. Today, as we remember the Tiananmen heroes, we must speak out in defense of all persecuted by Beijing, the Tibetans whose religion, culture, and language Beijing is brutally trying to erase, the people of Hong Kong whose basic rights are crushed daily, the Uyghurs subject to a campaign of genocide, the countless innocents languishing in prison cells on the mainland. If we do not speak out for human rights in China because of economic concerns, then we lose the moral authority to talk about human rights in any other place in the world. In 1991, I stood in Tiananmen Square with my colleagues and unfurled a black and white banner reading, "To those who died for democracy." Today and always, we must honor those who died for democracy, and we must defend those who fight for democracy and human rights in our time. Thank you, Dr. Jianlin Yang, Citizen Power Initiative for China, Dr. Katrina Lantos-Sweat, the Lantos Foundation, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, Athena, and all who have made this essential commemoration possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for your powerful message. You certainly represent what we are as a country. Now I want to welcome Congressman Tom Malinowski. Congressman Malinowski is a very important voice for human rights on the Hill and elsewhere. Congressman, please.
See me and hear me?
Oh, I can hear you, but I cannot see you.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Here you are. Yeah.
I'm here, and as you can see, I'm in my car on the highway. I just pulled over, but I did not want to miss this event or to have a chance to spend a few moments with you and Katrina and with your audience. This is such an important thing that you are doing, remembering this day, and it is made much more important by the efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to forget this day. I think we are all aware that this year's remembrance is more difficult than most past years in the sense that the coronavirus has prevented many people from gathering in person, and more importantly, Beijing's repression has prevented many people in places like Hong Kong from doing the traditional commemoration of this day. And you might wonder, why is it so important to simply remember an anniversary? Well, I think the Beijing government's actions remind us just how important it is. They are afraid of historical memory. They are afraid of the truth. They want people to forget, and so it becomes even more important for us to remember. There is a great deal happening right now in China that causes us great sadness and concern. Things have gotten worse, not better. Between the crackdown in Hong Kong, the ongoing persecution and genocide of the Uyghurs, the ongoing persecution in Tibet, and of course, the persecution of anybody in China who tries to assert the rights that are guaranteed to them under international and even domestic Chinese law. But I think there's something else happening around the world that should give us hope. I think there's much greater clarity in the United States, in Europe, in countries around the world about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party regime. There's greater clarity around the fact that simply engaging with and seeking to persuade that government through quiet diplomacy is not something that is going to work. There is an acknowledgement that democratic countries are in a contest right now with authoritarian countries, and that China is the leading proponent of the authoritarian idea that threatens all of our freedom, including in the United States. And we are beginning to see the development of policies in Washington, in European capitals, that acknowledge that basic fact. You know that I've been very active in the Congress with my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans. We are moving ahead in the House of Representatives with comprehensive legislation to address the range of challenges that China poses, including human rights challenges. It includes my legislation to make it easier for people in Hong Kong who are persecuted to come to the United States, including visas for Hong Kongers who have skills that we need in the United States, to send a signal to Beijing that if they continue this crackdown, they will lose the best and brightest people in that marvelous city. It includes legislation restricting technology exports to China, technology that can be used for mass surveillance. And today, we are introducing a new piece of legislation in the House, calling upon the International Olympic Committee to move the Winter Olympics away from China unless we see an end to the persecution of the Uyghurs. And the significant thing about this legislation is that similar bills are simultaneously today being introduced in 9 other parliaments around the world and in the European Parliament. I think we all know, I know from my diplomatic experience, that what China fears the most is not American action, but international action. When countries around the world coordinate, when we come together in a common stand against Chinese repression. And so that's what we are doing today. 10 countries plus the European Parliament, similar resolutions introduced in a coordinated way to pressure the International Olympic Committee, corporate sponsors, and governments to acknowledge that it is not right to hold the Winter Olympics in a country that is committing an ongoing genocide. So we are going to continue our work. Our work is very much informed by your activism, by the information that you provide us, and also the hope you provide us that a different kind of China and a different kind of relationship between China in the world is possible. Thank you so very much. And I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for your encouraging message. And thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to spend the time with us on this particular day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy.
We are particularly honored and encouraged to have Secretary Pompeo to speak to us today. He, as a Secretary of State, showed his caliber of anti-communism champion. Mr. Secretary, please.
Hello, I'm honored to join you today in commemorating the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen movement and to mourn those massacred by the Chinese Communist Party. In 1989, when the Chinese people were demanding freedom, I was an American soldier. I patrolled freedom's frontier on the western side of the Iron Curtain. Like so many before me, I was there to ensure communist totalitarianism wouldn't prevail. As my mission ended in West Germany, and shortly before the Berlin Wall collapsed in the fall, brave Chinese citizens, thousands of miles away, took their own stand against another communist party. In the spring of that year, they ignited the freedom movement in Tiananmen Square. Today, the Berlin Wall is gone. Freedom and democracy are alive in the lands that were part of the Soviet Empire. But communism, the greatest threat to human freedom and democracy, is emanating from another regime. Beijing is even more economically, militarily, and technologically menacing than was the Soviet Union. It's incumbent upon all of the people, Chinese and non-Chinese, to keep the flame of Tiananmen alive. We must all patrol freedom's frontier and protect the goddess of democracy. It's an incredible privilege to speak to you, so many of you who are so dedicated to that cause. May God bless you all.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm particularly glad to welcome Mr. Matt Pottinger, a legend in many ways. He was a Deputy National Security Advisor. He played a very important role in shifting US-China policy to the right direction. Mr. Pottinger, please.
Timmy, it's really nice to be with you and Katrina and the Tom Lantos Foundation. Thanks for this commemorative event. You know, when I was 16 years old, I was lucky enough to attend a high school that actually taught Mandarin as an alternative to French and Spanish. And so I took Mandarin lessons. And this was unusual in the 1980s. It was even more unusual that my high school had an exchange program. And so I, as a 16-year-old, prepared to visit Beijing and study at a Chinese school not far from Tiananmen Square for a few weeks of the summer. But I never got to make that trip because on the 20th of May, 1989, the authorities in China declared martial law and our trip was pulled down. But I did follow those events from afar that were unfolding in Beijing. I watched on TV and I began reading newspapers daily in the Boston Globe. And I was horrified with the world after the events of the night of June 3rd and morning of June 4th occurred. So about 5 years later, I finally made it to China as a college student. And on the eve of the 5th anniversary of the massacre in 1994, I was traveling with my family in Chongqing. And I remember having conversations with restaurant workers and students that were on that campus that we were visiting, for whom the memory of June 4th was still fresh. And but later that night, we got a knock on our door from the authorities. And my family and I were staying on a college dormitory. And the authorities came to check and see whether we were holding an illegal gathering. And so my brother and sister and father and I had a good laugh at the idea that they were somehow subversives. They were pretty much just jet lagged from having just arrived in China. But it reinforced for us how sensitive that date is, and you know, the party officials were leaving nothing to chance. 5 years after that, I was in Beijing for the 10th anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre. And I stayed up really late on the night of the 3rd to interview a veteran, a student veteran of those demonstrations. And I remember him telling me about the shocking vibration he felt in his hands when a PLA soldier's bullet struck the metal fence that he was vaulting himself over. And he told me it was at that moment that he understood the power of a bullet. But we weren't able to visit Tiananmen Square that year because the Chinese authorities had closed it to repave the whole square, you know, in the weeks leading up to and following that sensitive date. Lastly, on the 15th anniversary, I was back in Beijing again, this time as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And I'd gotten a scoop in the form of a letter that was written by Dr. Jiang Yanyong. Dr. Jiang was the whistleblower who had exposed the SARS epidemic that was raging in Beijing in 2003. And on this occasion, he had written a letter with his eyewitness account of what he had seen as all of the bloody, bullet-riddled bodies were brought to his hospital. So Dr. Jiang was put under house arrest for writing that letter, even though he was in his mid-70s at that point. So no matter how many years pass, this will always be the most sensitive date, 最敏感的时间 for the Chinese Communist Party. And it's a date that leaders in China dread. It's a date that they work hard to try to sweep history under the rug. And we note this year that the Chinese Communist Party has shut down a commemorative museum in Hong Kong. We know that social media platforms are being filled right now with orchestrated propaganda that are designed to deny the events of June 4th. And funny enough, I'm actually heartened that the party still puts so much effort into trying to cover up June 4th. And they have to work overtime, closing museums, closing public squares, disrupting gatherings like this one, putting 74-year-old doctors under house arrest and mobilizing their army of trolls on the internet. And I'm heartened by that because it gives us a glimpse into the catastrophic anxiety with which the Chinese Communist Party's leaders have to live every day, but especially on this sacred date. I'm heartened also because it shows that the Chinese Communist Party knows that the Chinese people have not forgotten what happened that night, and they never will. As Lu Xun wrote, lies written in ink cannot disguise facts written in blood. So I'm really delighted today to honor their memory, to hear this very moving symphony from Wang Xilin, and to hear from Cai Xia Jiao. And they honor the memory of all those brave Beijing students and workers, many of them just kids, who died for their convictions 32 years ago. Thanks, Jianli.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for sharing your story. You are such an inspiration. And I'm so happy we get together in this way on this particular day. Thank you, Matt. Now let's welcome Congressman Chris Smith. He is a co-chair of Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission of the US House of Representatives. Chairman Smith is a fixture on the Hill for human rights in China.
Special thanks to Dr. Yang, Dr. Sweat, and Ambassador Bremberg for your extraordinary work and for providing this opportunity to commemorate the 32nd anniversary of the Tiananmen pro-democracy protests and their violent suppression by the Chinese Communist Party. We remember the Tiananmen Square Chinese Communist Party massacre each year and profoundly honor the dead and the wounded because their dream was and is a noble one, and because there has been no justice whatsoever for the victims. We must never forget their extraordinary heroism in the face of tanks and bayonets, no matter how much the Chinese Communist Party wants the world to trivialize and ignore it. We remember Tiananmen each year because it's too important to forget and too dangerous to recognize inside of China. The world owes the leaders and courageous activists of the Tiananmen protests a huge debt of gratitude for their sacrifice. They demonstrated that democracy, liberty, respect for human rights, and the rule of law are truly universal, and that the Chinese people deserve better than the cruel communist dictatorship they have been forced to endure. The massacre on June 3rd and 4th of 1989 also showed the lengths to which the communists will go to brutally suppress the dream of freedom to maintain their stranglehold on power. While the Chinese Communist Party survived the seismic political shifts that brought down the Berlin Wall and Eastern European and Soviet communism, we must nevertheless recommit today, and for as long as it takes, to the freedom of every man, woman, and child living in China. We must dare to hope, never grow weary in doing good, and tenaciously work for that better day, utterly convinced that the Chinese Communist Party's cruelty, depravity, and selfish governance need not be forever. We will always stand with the oppressed and not the oppressor, no matter how long it takes. As all of you know, Xi Jinping's dictatorship has unleashed a new brutal assault on religious freedom, human rights in general, ethnic minorities, and the suppression of Tibet and Hong Kong. Millions of children have been killed and women irreparably harmed as a direct result of over 4 decades of coercive population control, which relies on forced abortion and involuntary sterilization to achieve its nefarious goals. Xi Jinping planned and is today committing a massive genocide against the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. Yet Xi Jinping also plans on hosting the 2022 Winter Olympics, a grim reminder of the 1936 Nazi Olympics. Thank you, Dr. Yang, for your eloquent testimony a couple of weeks ago at my congressional hearing in opposition to the Beijing Genocide Olympics. For its part, the United States must be a leader, advocating for greater freedom and democracy, levying sanctions for those complicit in corruption and abuse, including expanded use of the Global Magnitsky Act penalties. A democratic China, one that respects human rights and is governed by the rule of law, poses no threat to its own people, the region, or the world. I do believe that someday China will be free, and a nation of free Chinese men and women will honor and celebrate the heroes of Tiananmen and thank them in perpetuity for sacrificing so much for so long for freedom.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you for your message. We will continue to look up to your leadership for the human rights work we do. Thank you. Now let's welcome Ambassador Sam Brownback. Mr. Brownback was a U.S. Senator for many years and a governor of Kansas and ambassador for international religious freedom. He is a conscience of this country, a true human rights champion. Now, Mr. Ambassador, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sam Brownback. I'm a former ambassador for religious freedom and U.S. Senator from Kansas. The world must never forget the Tiananmen massacre that took place in broad daylight in front of everybody's eyes around the world. No matter how much revisionist history or people want to kind of paper over or say that was in the past, we must never forget. We must thank the people that stood up for freedom then and continue to stand for freedom now. We must encourage that. I love the Chinese people. One of my children is Chinese. We love the people so much. And yet they don't live in freedom. The Chinese Communist Party seeks to put forward in the world an authoritarian regime that denies religious freedom, basic human rights for individuals, under some sort of disguise of community rights, when it's really just them that is defining the community and they are the ones that have the rights. We must never forget, we must never stop fighting for these basic human rights for the people of China, like what the people were fighting for in Tiananmen Square 32 years ago. Keep fighting, keep pushing forward. It will happen. The Chinese people will be free. Thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for your powerful message. Now let's welcome Mr. Nuri Turkel. He is a commissioner of U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom. Welcome, Nuri, please.
Hello, my name is Nuri Turkel. I want to begin by thanking the Citizens Power Initiatives for China for inviting me to participate in this important event. Today, we gather to reflect on the events of June 4th, 1989, when the world was forced to watch as the Chinese Communist Party greeted peaceful protesters with violence, when thousands of Chinese citizens paid the ultimate price for advocating for freedom and democracy. I know exactly where I was during the Tiananmen Square massacre. In fact, I was in college, watching images flown out of brave men and women standing tall in pursuit of civil liberties, staring down PLA, tear gas, and tanks. These tragic and terrifying images are etched into all of our minds. They make it easy to forget that for a moment, 32 years ago, June 4th had the potential to become a bastion of hope, the genesis of free and democratic China after 40 years of communism and autocracy. The CCP was faced with a choice: listen to its people crying out for change, or terminate the protest using all means necessary. The CCP, of course, chose the latter and has continued to do so ever since. Over the past 3 decades, China has perfected the art of oppressing its citizens and crushing resistance movements before they can blossom. However, this does not change the fact that the seeds of liberty and democracy are planted in China and everywhere the CCP wills its ruthless reign. This past year, we have watched this reality born out of in Hong Kong. This great city that once enjoyed a high degree of freedom and rule of law has now descended into a chaos as the Chinese Communist Party and Hong Kong government arbitrarily imposed draconian national security law on Hong Kong, quashed peaceful protests, detained and imprisoned democracy activists. We also witnessed the sentencing of Hong Kong democracy activists. Many of them are well-known political, business, and community leaders, such as Martin Lee, known as the father of democracy in Hong Kong, and Jimmy Lai, a successful and visionary businessman and activist. Hundreds of other Hong Kong protesters and activists will languish in Chinese prison for the crime of standing up for democracy and the rule of law. Chinese oppression does not stop at quelling political movements. As we speak, the Chinese officials are in the process of sterilizing, indoctrinating, and enslaving its Uyghur population. The CCP is perpetuating a genocide against the Uyghurs simply because it sees Uyghur religious and cultural vibrancy as a threat to their absolute rule. Beijing has deployed its full arsenal of propaganda and diversion tactics to convince the world that they are improving the lives of the Uyghurs and providing them with jobs and security. Yet the evidence and the first-hand accounts speak for themselves. In pursuit of uniformity and control, the CCP is perpetuating the legacy of Tiananmen Square massacre by systematically torturing and killing its own citizens. The CCP government under Xi Jinping has lost all credibility. To the CCP, there's no rule of law, but rule by law. The CCP and its leaders have no respect for the law. Instead, they use the law to crack down on dissent and bolster the communist regime's legitimacy. 32 years after the communist government showed its true colors on the global stage, it is time that the world call the CCP what it is, an exporter of authoritarianism and a genocidal regime. As people who believe passionately in human rights, democracy, and rule of law, we cannot stand for the status quo of CCP. We will not stand silent as the CCP attempts to destroy innocent lives and erase entire culture. We will continue to sound the alarm until the whole world knows the evils that the CCP stands for. We will honor those who have been massacred by the CCP in pursuit of liberty. Armed with the memory of June 4th, 1989, and the hope for freedom carried by the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy protesters, we will strive to ensure that the freedom, democracy, and rule of law is a reality in our generation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today.
Thank you, Nuri. Thank you so much for your insights. I'm particularly happy to have Mr. Gandalf Turing with us today. He is the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to North America. Now, Mr. Representative, please.
Good morning and Tashi Delek. My name is Notup Turing. I am the North America representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration. The Chinese Communist Party may be a powerful country that institutes genocidal policies, but it will never be able to change the history. The free will of the people gets strengthened more by government interference and atrocities. 32 years ago, when students in Tiananmen Square were murdered under the martial law, His Holiness the Dalai Lama openly criticized Chinese leaders for using force and showed support to the student activists, even though it was during a critical time in Sino-Tibet dialogue. Many victims of the CCP, including Tibetans, have raised the alarm of the CCP's cruelty for decades, but little was done to resist the onslaught. Unfortunately, many world leaders were persuaded by the CCP, since the CCP is skillful in using fashionable language of liberalism to hide their true intentions. Even after the Tiananmen Square massacre, the West thought that increased relations with China would liberalize the Chinese government. How wrong they were. Every Tibetan could tell that the idea was based on fantasy, because we have lived through the Chinese government's lies. However, the pandemic has enabled the free world to see the true colors of the CCP, and there seems to be a global awakening now, a genuine wokeness, to use the trendy term. This is why it is important more than ever for all of us, Chinese citizens, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Southern Mongolians, Falun Gong practitioners, Christians, Taiwanese, to fight collectively. In individual numbers, we are not many, but we are substantial together. There is a strength in numbers and force in solidarity. Indeed, it must not be forgotten that several Tibetan students protested for pro-democracy during Tiananmen Square protests. It is sorrowful that we must continue to protest for basic human rights. However, through protests I have seen on the ground and at events like these, many diverse faces come together for the common good. With that being said, Dr. Yang Cheli, thank you very much for organizing this and for having me as a part of this important event. We must not forget what happened in 1989 in Tiananmen Square and in 1959 in Tibet. Thank you, Tukji Che.
Thank you so much, Mr. Representative, for your touching message. Our warmest regards to His Holiness. Thank you. By now, many people must have already heard the story that tanks run over students in Liu Bukou on Beijing's Chang'an Avenue. I was one of the witnesses. But now, today, I want to present to you a true hero, Mr. Fang Zheng. Mr. Fang Zheng was among the students who just left Tiananmen Square on the morning of June 4th, 1989, when he found 4 tanks running behind the clock. He pushed a student, a female student beside him to the sidewalk, and he himself did not escape soon enough, got run over by tanks, and he lost both his legs. And he's a living evidence of the massacre. And he has continued to fight for the truth and for human rights in China to this day. Now let's welcome Mr. Fang Zheng.
大家好，感谢杨建立博士，感谢王锡林教授，感谢彩霞老师，感谢所有的朋友们，能在今天这么一个特别的日子，我们能在这里用这么一种特殊的方式，我们来纪念32年前在中国在北京发生的那一个特殊的日子， 那么一个让所有的人不能忘记的这么一个惨案。我叫方震，我现在在美国旧金山。32年前，1989年的6月4号上午，我是从天安门广场最后撤离广场的学生队伍当中的一员。所以，当我从天安门广场和平撤出，行进到西长安街六部口的路段的时候，但是在那里，我们这些学生遭遇了一个从身后突然冲杀过来的这么一队中国人民解放军的坦克。所以这个就是当时我们完全是没有想到的，因为我们是从广场和平的撤出，而且是在离开广场往学校走的路上，可是没有想到坦克就在我们的身后，也是从东向西高速的冲向了我们行走在西长安街上的这些来自北京各高校的学生，我就是当中的一员。所以在六部口有很多学生在那里死于坦克的履带之下，我的双腿就是在那里被坦克履带碾压失去。32年过去了，所以每到这么一个时刻啊，我真的其实不是太想过多的回忆那一刻，可是又不得不说我们所经历的这一切，这种每个人的这种真实的经历。因为大家知道，在中国尽管经过了32年，中国政府共产党这个政权依然是不允许人们去言说六四，不允许人们去追寻六四的真相。所以在这个时刻，我们不能忘记32年前在北京在天安门所失去生命的那些同胞，那些勇敢的向暴政进行抗暴的那些英勇的北京市民。所以我们不能忘掉他们，我们更不能忘记去追问当时的这一切这种历史的真相。我们不要忘记去追问这个历史的真相，尽管经过了32年，我们同时也不会放弃对这个历史惨案的这么一个责任人的最后的历史责任的追究。所以在这里，我是利用这个机会跟大家说，我们不要忘记，我们更不能放弃我们当初的理想，就是要追求一个自由民主的、一个人人平等而富足的一个新的中国。这是我们当时所追求的理想，也是我们现在每个人所应该追求的一个理想。所以感谢大家今天能够来到这里，能够在这么一个特别的日子当中，我们依然能够用我们自己所能够的方式去表达我们对那些逝去的生命的这种敬意，来同时来再一次去唤醒我们自己内心的良知，也重新去坚定我们对未来追求的这种理想。再一次感谢大家，感谢杨建立博士，感谢王锡林教授，感谢蔡霞老师，感谢所有的参加活动的所有的来宾，谢谢大家。
Thank you for Fang Zheng. Yes, we will not give up fighting for the truth, fighting for freedom and justice. God bless you and your family. Now let me introduce to you a young leader, a Hong Kong student leader, Ms. Joy Siu. Joy, please.
Thank you, Citizen Power Initiative for China, and our amazing co-organizers for putting together this very important event, and for having me here today to speak to you all. My name is Joey Siu. I was born in North Carolina and moved to Hong Kong when I was 7 years old. During my time in Hong Kong, every year on June 4th, there would be thousands of people gathering at the Victoria's Park in Hong Kong, lighting up candles, singing songs, and chanting slogans in remembrance of one of the most brutal and violent crackdown on freedom and democracy in the history of mankind. Hong Kong has always been the beacon of democracy for China, and for so many years, the city has been the only place under Chinese communist rule that still allows discussions around the Tiananmen massacre, that still permits the organization of candlelight vigils and other memorial events in the remembrance of all those who sacrificed to defend freedom and democracy. Every year it was not only Hong Kongers who attended the event, but also a lot of freedom-loving people from China, from Taiwan, and from a lot of other countries and places. But unfortunately, none of us would be able to do it again this year, or in fact, not anymore in the future in Hong Kong. This year, on the 32nd anniversary of the historical student movement, the Hong Kong government announced that they will be banning June 4th candlelight vigils in the city. Anyone who organizes memorial events, anyone who wears black, anyone who holds a candle, or actually anyone who dares to tell the truth, will be arrested and jailed. This is how the Chinese Communist Party is trying to wipe out history, and this is also why it is more important than ever that we have to remember history. We all have to remember that on June 4th, 1989, at the Tiananmen Square, the Chinese Communist Party sent its army to murder its own students, who were only there peacefully protesting for freedom and democracy that they deserve. Soldiers shot them with guns and rolled over their bodies with tanks. That was what happened on June 4th, 1989. Time flies. 32 years passed, but suppression from the Chinese Communist Party never ends. Dissidents in China are silenced, suppressed, and persecuted. Uyghurs in East Turkestan are suffering from an ongoing genocide. Tibetans are not able to return to the homeland. Leaders and activists of Hong Kong are imprisoned, and the rest are living under fear every single day. We all have to remember history, for history reminds us of the weight, the meaning, the value, and the preciousness of freedom and democracy. We all have to remember history and do more than remembering it. Tonight, let us all light a candle for those who cannot. Remember history and pass on the spirit. Take actions and prevent history from repeating again. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for your message. Thank you so much. On this particular moment, we must not forget Liu Xiaobo, the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Liu Xiaobo was a major leader of 1989 democracy movement in Tiananmen Square. After the massacre, he was repeatedly detained by the Chinese authorities. And when he won Nobel Peace Prize, he was detained, was blocked from coming to Oslo to receive the award. And he died in detention in 2017. Now we must remember him and we will fight in his spirit. Now today, I'm glad to have a friend of Liu Xiaobo, Mr. Cai Chu. He himself is a poet and editor of Minzhu Zhongguo. He will recite a poem he wrote particularly for Liu Xiaobo. Now, Mr. Cai Chu.
自刘晓波，秋雨中得知你，会将我泪如雨下，仿佛一听到我们熟悉的大可把。本言流逝，是改不上你说对不起王力。断续的哭泣，像这秋雨绵着牵挂。有人说你软弱雨水不够刚烈，有人说你水滴石穿已经幻化。我说不要捧你上祭坛，留下喊你回家。2010年10月。
Thank you, Mr. Cai Chu. Now let me introduce another participant of 1989 democracy movement, Professor Xia Ming. He is the chairman of Laogai Foundation. Mr. Xia Ming, please.
Hello, my friends. During this American Memorial Day week, we're remembering what happened 32 years ago in China. That year, for me, it is very personal because it disrupted my entire life and also caused my permanent dislocation. But today, I want to share some of my general observations and also my general reflections upon 1989 student movement. First, I must emphasize it is a national movement, and we sometimes tend to forget about what happened beyond Beijing. Actually, in March from Lhasa, Tibet, and then all the way to April and May, and nationwide, the Chinese people, especially the young people, and they started student movements and rebellions and protests longing for democracy. Second, I wanted to emphasize it is a natural expression of the natural longing for democracy and freedom by the Chinese people. Many people, they tend to forget about that China was the first republic created in Asia. So the Chinese people, they do have a long history of fighting for democracy and liberty. So I think 1989, and it's just part of this continuity. So today, this continuity is going to go on. And so I'm optimistic someday democracy and liberty will settle down in that country. The third, I wanted to emphasize that this movement was rational, well organized, and also very patriotic. Sometimes people tend to forget about the well organization and also the rationality revealed by the Chinese students because of the June 4th crackdown. Actually, if we look beyond Beijing, and especially from the city where I'm from, and in Shanghai, and we can find out the rational negotiations, they created eventual rational accommodations. So we avoided bloodshed. So this is how I think, and in Chinese democratic tradition, and we still can continue and our rational, reasonable, non-violent fight for democracy. And so we can be a fighter for democracy, and at the same time we can be patriotic and for this great country. Then the last point I want to point out is the 1989 student movement really was historically significant because it achieved a lot. If you do not believe my conclusion, you look at what happened to the former Soviet Union, what happened to all other communist regimes in the Eastern European countries. And we have to thank the Chinese students, their fights and their contribution for the downfall of communism in the former Soviet Union and in the Eastern European countries. And also we have to remember today, every year for the past 32 years, the Chinese Communist regime and often tremble over the exact date of June 4th. So it speaks volume about the historic significance. So today, I hope all of us, we're going to remember what we did before, and we're going to prepare ourselves for what we can do for the future. This is what I can say on the exact day of June 4th, and to remember what happened 32 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Xiaming. Thank you for your message. Let's move to next speaker, Mr. Times Wang. He is a lawyer and he is a human rights activist. But it will be remiss if I don't mention his father. His father is Dr. Wang Bingzhang, the founder of the Overseas Chinese Democracy Movement. He was kidnapped by Chinese security personnel in 2002 and taken back to China, and later sentenced to life. As we speak, Dr. Wang is languishing in Chinese prison, serving his life sentence. On this particular moment, we must not forget Dr. Wang Bingzhang. Now, let's have Times.
Hello, everyone. My name is Times Wang. Thank you, Dr. Yang, for inviting me to make a short statement on this occasion, commemorating those who died for democracy on June 4, 1989. And thanks everyone else for bearing with the fact that I'm making this statement in English rather than Chinese. Many of you know me as the son of Wang Bingzhang, a well-known Chinese democracy activist. But I want to speak today less in that capacity and more to offer some observations on democracy as an American. These are some things I've come to realize as a citizen of the world's oldest democracy, and one that is currently in an undeniably perilous state. But they are things that I think have relevance to today's audience, given that all of us are believers in democracy and given that we are here to commemorate those who gave their lives for that belief. The first observation is this: democracy is extremely hard work. I first realized this when I knocked on doors in the 2016 presidential campaign. Between the sheer physicality of walking to hundreds of strangers' houses and the bracing experience of speaking with voters you strongly disagree with, it was an enormous amount of effort for little to no tangible reward. My understanding of this reality has since deepened. In 2018, I knocked on doors for congressional candidates. In 2019, I knocked on doors for a friend who is running for office in Virginia. And in the 2020 campaign, I did the digital equivalent of knocking on doors. All of it was hard work, none of it paid anything, and no one gave me any material reward for doing any of it. How is that relevant to today's event? Well, to me, it suggests that the fact that China isn't yet a democracy, despite more than 30 years having passed since 1989, is not evidence that the Chinese democracy movement has failed. Instead, it's evidence of the inherent difficulty of democracy itself. And that's something I think that we can take heart in. This brings me to another, even more hopeful observation, which is that democracy may be inherently difficult, but it's also inherently rewarding. Over the course of the campaigns that I have volunteered in the last 5 years, I've interacted with hundreds, if not thousands, of fellow voters on a one-on-one basis. And the remarkable thing is that even in these extremely polarized times, and even when I disagreed with these voters, these interactions have been overwhelmingly positive. Many even thanked me for knocking on their door. But if you think about it, this shouldn't be all that surprising. After all, the practice of democracy is in many ways just ordinary people having a conversation with each other about what kind of world we want to live in, and then trying to make that world a reality in a non-violent way. Indeed, I would argue that today's event, this event, is itself a form of democratic practice, humble as it may be. This event is our way of saying, collectively, as a group of ordinary people, that unlike the regime in Beijing, we do not want to live in a world where those who died on June 4 are simply forgotten. It is our way of saying that we emphatically reject such a cruel and cynical vision of political life. It is our way of saying that we will never abandon our belief that China will one day have a government that doesn't bully those who merely want to pay tribute to those who died on June 4, but will instead treat them the way they deserve to be treated, as heroes. And though we know that getting to that day will be extremely hard work, it will forever be our honor and our pleasure to engage in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Times, for your insight. Very inspiring. Thank you so much. We are particularly glad that a young American college student joined us at this commemoration event. Next, I will introduce you Ms. Courtney Britt. She is Southern Regional Vice Chair of College Republican National Committee. Courtney, please.
Thank you, Citizen Power Initiatives for China, the Tom Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and the Athena Institute for planning and hosting this event today, And thank you for inviting me. It is such an honor to join you all virtually here. Today, we pay tribute to the bravery of the student activists who demanded liberty and justice in Tiananmen Square in 1989. As a student activist and a leader of organized student activism in the United States, their resolve to stand for what is right at all cost is especially remarkable and inspiring to me. Their bravery was and continues to be an inspiration for student activists around the world. Student activism and student protest have played an important role in so many events, especially those related to democracy and equal rights. In fact, it was student activism that led the 1986 demonstrations, which ultimately birthed the Tiananmen Square protests. In the months preceding the massacre, student activists organized formally to appropriately demand for human rights in China. They initiated the hunger strike of May 1989, and they led the way for tens of thousands of protesters. These students advocated for human rights and liberty for the Chinese people. They called out the corruption of the Chinese Communist Party, and many of them ultimately sacrificed their lives for it. But the spirit and the movement for freedom and democracy that they created has survived them. Their courage and their mission have motivated so many, and we must continue to pass on their legacy. It is crucial that we continue to remember the events of the Tiananmen Square massacre. The Chinese Communist Party wants all of us to forget what happened. They have worked to erase the history of these courageous student activists, both at home and abroad. The very fact that they work so hard to write over this history is evidence of its effect. That's why it's important 32 years later that we still gather and mark this day to carry on their legacy, to remember their work and efforts, and to keep fighting for freedom. Today, 32 years later, the same injustices and corruption that necessitated the Tiananmen Square demonstrations still have a strong hold in China. They still infringe on human rights of the Chinese people, particularly those of the Uyghurs and Christians and other minority groups. And despite economic growth over the last 32 years, there has been no progress. In fact, there has been a regression of liberty for the Chinese people. So, as American student activists, we will continue to tell the story of the Tiananmen Square massacre. We will keep their spirit alive, and we will continue to expose the corruption, the misinformation, and the injustices of the Chinese government in order to maintain a movement for liberty and justice for all, including the Chinese people. We need to encourage students to rise up, to get involved and speak out. When students get involved, change happens.
Thank you, Courtney, for your inspiring message. Thank you. Let's welcome Keely Sage. She's the president of Tennessee College Democrats. Keely.
Distinguished guests, hello and good morning to you all. My name is Keely Sage, and I speak before you today on this occasion not only as the president of Tennessee College Democrats and a former delegate to the Democratic National Convention, but as a student. To begin, I would like to express my gratitude to the host of this event, to my fellow speakers, and to those in the audience with us today. It is my intention in speaking before you to convey the views of those my age and to shed some light on the actions. And today, before this distinguished assembly, I also thank you, Dr. Yang, who has so kindly welcomed me and invited me to speak. The timing of this could not be more important. The Chinese Communist Party has been increasingly aggressive in its efforts to silence the commemorations of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And for the first time in the 32 years since then, there will be no large public commemoration of the event in the Chinese language world. While the Chinese government has been consistent in its brutal censorship and repression efforts on the mainland, in Hong Kong for the second straight year, the authorities banned the annual vigil to commemorate the massacre, as Human Rights Watch reports. With all of this taking place, and with General Secretary Xi calling for a change in tone, but not, however, any change of plan, this regime has been increasingly bold in its attempts to suppress the truth. For the past 3 decades, the CCP has faced little besides verbal condemnations for its heinous actions. Fortunately, however, the tide is turning among students. Nothing has made this so evident as the Washington Appeal. Released on May 13th of last year, it was a culmination of months-long grassroots efforts by students across the United States intended to support Chinese civil society and called to attention the CCP's assault on democratic institutions. More recently, on April 5th of 2021, the College Democrats of America unanimously passed a resolution condemning the CCP for its genocide of Uyghurs and announcing support for a boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics. In my home state of Tennessee, I joined with college Republicans in recognizing the organizational threat posed to academic freedom by Confucius Institutes and helped lay the basis for legislation to protect the rights of students and scholars on campus. More must be done to honor the memory of those martyred by the Chinese Communist Party. Those who have the freedom to speak out have a corresponding responsibility to do so. We, with whatever limited influence we may hold, have an obligation to speak out and to show solidarity with the Uyghur people and push for our democratic leaders to do more. Thank you.
Thank you, Keely, for your powerful message. Thank you. I think everybody is eager to watch and listen to conversation between Master Wang Xilin and Professor Cai Xia on Master Wang's life and work, how the Symphony No. 3 was composed, what each movement attempts to express, and other highlights of Symphony No. 3. Now, the conversation.
各位朋友，大家好，王锡林老先生，您好。
你好，大家好。
今年是8964的第32周年。32年前，64那段时间里，北京城里、天安门广场，刀光血影，枪弹四射，一个个鲜活的生命就此逝去了。64屠杀震惊了世界，从那以后，中国人的心里又增添了一个永远难以抚平的伤痛。时隔32年了，那一段的血与火，我们至今刻骨铭心。8964后的一年，在北京一个简陋的房间里，诞生了泣鬼神撼天地的王锡林先生第3交响乐。王锡林先生的交响乐作品曾经被莫斯科音乐学院的霍勒包娃教授评论为继承和发展了肖斯塔科维奇的路线和传统。王锡林先生的第3交响乐是专为2次天安门广场事件来创作的。今天，我们将以这部继承了肖斯塔科维奇风格和路线的第3交响乐，来纪念64的殉难者。我们先请王锡林老先生谈谈他的生平经历和创作第3交响乐的过程和感受。有请王锡林老先生。
谢谢大家，谢谢大家给这么个机会，让我和大家见面，来讲我自己的作品。大家知道，从很多年以来，我们中国直到现在，很多话都是不能说的。中国人民，包括我本人，经历了很多苦难。我这些苦难就是因为说真话引起的。但是，音乐可以表达那些语言不能表达的内容。柴可夫斯基说，当语言不能表达的时候，音乐就全副武装地登场了。所以说，音乐是一种高度浓缩的、高度概括的表现社会生活的一种艺术形式，而且音乐是超越国际的语言。凭着音乐，我们就可以能够聚起来，有共同情怀、有共同信念的朋友。我这一辈子写了10部交响乐和其他一些作品。那么64时间，也就是1984年的1989年的64期间，我在北京，在那个热血沸腾的日子里，我们全部的注意力都集中在街头和大学生身上。我本人也到广场上去被人们拥护，在平板车上发表过2次讲演。但是64很快的就被这个军车 是划破北京城天安门广场上夜空的枪声，坦克隆隆，这些可怕的现象，真的都发生了。定佛的人声，隆隆的坦克声，这些都是每一个人刻骨铭心难忘的事件，重大事件。多少人倒在血泊中？但是嘛，有些人一直想掩盖这种真相，来抹杀这个真相，淡化人们的记忆。但是嘛，这32年过去了，我们今天重新来纪念这个日子，来大家介绍我的第3交响乐，这是非常难得的一个机会。我这里向大家介绍一下我个人的经历啊。我是1962年毕业从上海音乐学院的，我毕业后被分配在北京的中央广播交响乐团。那么1964年年初，中国开始了社会主义教育运动，就简称社教运动了。领导上鼓励我们向大家提意见，我们很相信官员们的话，就真的提了2小时言，而且发了2小时，批评了乐团的一些工作方向、工作任务、工作方向、工作性质问题。我说我们就吃政治饭，对吧？这个没有按照交响乐艺术来做事情。那么这个发言嘛，正好就撞在一个枪口上，因此就在广播交响乐团里边，把我作为一个重点，全团大会开了，在半年中间开了10次，呀，这10次大会非常厉害。到了64年4月，把我们就开除出共青团，把我们也开除出广播乐团。打到了，就流放到了雁门关外的大同市雁北文工团。这2年嘛，是我这2年最苦最当的活，努力工作，努力改造啊。但是嘛，到了68年了，就派来的公宣队进来，掀起了对批改新高潮，把我和一些人又一次抓起来，批斗。这批斗的最重要的是一些现象，就我记忆很深的一些现象，就是把我们一个县一个村一个村，行军拉出去，一个村一个麻绳捆着手啊，背上背着牌子，反革命分子王锡林，带上标签，黑标签，带上黑牌子，反革命分子什么东西的，一个村一个村斗，就是吃日烈焰呀，哎呀，一直走着长途跋涉中间，我心里就有了一种很悲壮的感觉。我感到就是一个，这不就像12月党人的囚徒一样吗？我心里还有几种悲壮的自豪感。对，我感觉我很好，我提了意见，我坚持了我的艺术规律，我还很自豪，有这种悲壮的自豪感。于是这个囚徒，我这个囚徒的形象啊，这个囚徒的主题就在我心里边盘旋了20-30年都不会再没有消失啊。慢慢的，我离开大同以后，到了长治，慢慢以后嘛，能看到参考消息的。在参考消息中间，我知道这些人有个索尔仁尼琴，有苏联，有持不同政见者，还有叛逃到美国去的艺术家、芭蕾舞演员、音乐家、钢琴家等等。这个索尔仁尼琴的印象在我心里非常深刻呀。然后文革结束以后嘛，到了78年，我回到北京了，我就到处想找这个书啊，有3卷本很厚的3卷本书啊，这古拉格群岛。我读了这个书以后，使我的思想大变化。我感到我总些东西都受了骗，都错误了。对，我们国家共产主义历史全是错的，不是这个样子，从理论到实践都是错的。我有这么一个思想。而且那书里面记录了在这个集中营的暴动，集中营的囚犯们暴动啊，和暴动们派坦克去镇压，所以我对这个杀人暴动这个场面我太清楚了。哎呀，我深深的印脑子里。那么以后嘛，这中间还经历一件事，就是这个第一次天安门事件，就是这个1976年周恩来总理故世，人们去广场献花圈。又不让献花圈，不让做，这是一次大的冲突啊！据说是木棒子打。这时候我还在外地，没有回北京的。但是这个天安门事件第一次事件冲突深深的进脑子里，据说抓了不少人，打死不少人，关押了不少人。以后四人帮打倒了，这些人放了，这第一次反革命是算平反了。 平凡归平凡的，但是我现在的纪念太深刻了，我就写了第2交响曲，我就泪学活。但是写完以后嘛，就是79年和80年做的，做完以后我感觉技术太老了，都是文化革命前从前用那些浪漫派那些传统老技术，我感觉很不满意。试奏以后就放下了。于是经过这10年中间嘛，就是贺鲁丁院长教给我们的吭哧学技术呀，要吭哧的学技术，这10年就学技术呀，就是学习现代派技术，学习西方20世纪的技术。这时候就知道了勋伯格的12音体系，知道了欧洲有个潘迪格斯基，他写的这个纪念广岛巡难者这么一个伟大的作品。我把这个作品拿到手以后，他技术了不得呀，那里面很大的一块全适合我用啊。花了10年功夫来技术重新革新了我的美学，我就有了一种思想。天安门事件正好在这儿发生了。我们当天晚上我在广场很快就出来了，但是没有在我在我在东四这个10条这个胡同在喝酒，但真的听到这枪响。我回来以后，我这些年听到了很多天安门事情，有这些画面在我脑子挥之不去呀。到了这时候我开始写第3交响曲，第1乐章就写囚徒，这是个慢板。这个慢板我集中写了民族的苦难。
我当时就是天安门广场响起枪声，是震惊了我，因为我从小到大，他们教育说解放军不能来枪杀人民，说人民解放军是人民子弟兵啊，所以天安门广场的那个开枪也是震惊了我，让我感觉到过去很多宣传是欺骗人的。因此你的这部交响乐的第1乐章一开始，我听到的就是低音弦乐为主的，然后是低音的管乐加入的，反复盘旋低沉音声的威胁和压迫，这就一下子就把我带进了那个阴霾遍地的灰暗的时空里。我感受到中国人民的苦难在你这个第1乐章里边来表现出来了。
是的，第1乐章就集中写苦难。这个从68年有了囚徒的形象，我感到我们这个民族都是个囚徒啊。对，我们被奴役，对，没有思想自由。对，鲁迅先生早说过，对我们人民是哀其不幸，怒其不争啊。对，这个对我鲁迅这个影响对我是印象太深刻了，这样的。那么这个第1乐章集中写苦难，也是憋了20-30年这个想法了，于是就集中写这个囚徒的形象。这囚徒形象就是一个在冰天雪地里边呀，茫茫雪原，大雪纷飞呀，脚带镣铐，沉重的镣铐啊，我们看不见这个囚徒的面孔，只看见那些灰色的动物在漫漫雪原上想着说蠕动，无声的大雪纷飞。这个画面在我脑子里好长时间呀，挥之不去。这是我第1乐章想表现的东西。这里边，我也看到好多，我也想到好多枪杀场面的，鞭打场面，枪杀场面。这里面写的这个枪杀政治犯，我们知道多少事情啊？也还有这个迫害胡风他们这些人，迫害右派们，他们在冰天雪地里边劳动，那不都是囚犯吗？所以我第1乐章集中写这些东西的。
是的，我在第1乐章里边听到了低音管乐的音声，感受到就是压得我喘不过气来。但是第1乐章的后半部分，我听到的是高音的弦乐发出的凄厉之声，犹如被囚禁、被奴役的人民在哭诉。接着我就听到你那个第2乐章的开始，整个第2乐章的反差对比太强烈了，让我感受到你用音符描述的场面极为复杂，极为错综，有铁蹄铮铮的践踏声，有烈焰升腾的血光，有阴险狡诈的狞笑，还有拼死抗争的这种呼号。是
这样的，对。第2乐章是重头戏，第1乐章是一个 序引呢，这个慢版的引子，光这个引子就15分钟啊，很长很长啊。这个慢版的引子沉重啊，我们历史上没有这么写过中亚国历史，没有人这么写过。对呀，我这个概括，我想概括很长的历史啊，这是我的想法啊。那么第2乐章，第1乐章是这个结果，我们就看不见慢片子，这里面有这个枪毙人很可怕的呀。我小孩的时候，我在13、14岁，我看见过一次枪毙人呢，很害怕的呀。那会儿很害怕，我就写的这个恐怖的这种声音啊。那么一开始的第2场这个重头戏就是第2章，大概有光第2乐章就将近20分钟啊，很大的就是好像这么样。因为一开始一个残暴的主题出来是吧，一个引子，然后出第1段嘛，就是写一些跳梁小丑的政治家们，他们伪善的布置好陷阱，对吧？这多么可怕的动作，可怕，没有人揭发过这种事情，是吧？受骗上当，毛主席讲的就是阳谋，叫你说话叫阳谋。对，所以我这边写的就是先写一种他们这个戴着面具的微笑假笑啊，像小丑一般的跳舞，他们在安排陷阱啊。对，在他们看来，政治家是赌博，所以一开始有那么1分钟的样子吧，是写这个小丑的形象，那不久就露出来这个凶暴凝重的面孔啊。这时候我就想到了公主坟啊，我还不在场啊，我听到后面好多人跟我说公主坟怎么样，那些兵们一个一个左手举着那个透亮的盾牌，后面拿着枪哒哒哒，我就出现了军盾牌的形象，哒哒哒哒哒哒哒哒，这个主题我就这么出来了啊。这是一个残暴的主题啊，这是一段音乐。那么这个主题开始有大屠杀的各种场面呀。于是我想到这个枪弹一打，人们像鸟兽般的奔逃啊，四面奔逃啊，悲惨极了。你们可以想象多少人在坦克下面辗转，对吧？逃也逃不掉，背着伤拖，有些把人拖回去，好多就非常可怕。这是我想象的这个画面啊。这第2乐章这样就接着写，然后这突然就是这高潮，就大屠杀的高潮啊，有2架电影哇的叭，山雨欲来风满楼啊，这大的高潮，这写大概10几分钟长啊。那么完了这段到了尾巴嘛，就是天安门前一片死寂，一片死沉沉的场面，遍地是血呀，然后什么？政治家们在血衣上面跳舞，对，在血亮上面在广场上跳舞，对吧？他们露出了狞笑，对吧？这多么可怕的场面呀！所以最后是慢慢结束，就回到那个跋涉的主题上来，阴暗的跋涉主题上来。这主题嘛，上面有这个流血呀，血是没声音的呀，在地上流啊，对，这样就是音乐没完，这第1场就是头场的结尾，这么结束了。对，
是的，老先生，这一乐章真的是把人的心都震碎了。接着我注意到的是，第2乐章和第3乐章之间啊，有那么5秒钟多的静默，象征着大屠杀以后的一片死寂。接着是很短促的、很细微的，弱到你似乎又有，似乎又没听到的那个声音，慢慢的复苏了。然后第3乐章是极度压抑的那种呜咽、悲愤，接着就是剑后的凄厉，长夜无尽，冤魂呼号啊！30多年来，天安门广场的死难者们，他们的冤魂一天都没有安宁，我们的心情一天也没有平静。所以王锡林老先生，我记得您说第3乐章您想表现的是一种萦绕在心头久久不绝的一首歌，那是个什么样的歌呢？
疯子的歌，对，这个政治迫害呀，叫你反复交代呀， 写剪刀材料一把把把人逼疯啊！那在北京，我这26岁、27岁整我全团10次大会啊，我吓得发抖啊，在那里吓得呀，我没有经过这场面，但是以后的政治斗争比那还可怕，所以我感到很多人逼疯了呀，很多人自杀了。那逼疯的，我就想怎么写个疯子的歌呀？这个疯子的歌是我一个创作课题，我不断的想这个怎么能写一个疯子还唱歌？哎呀，这个疯子嘛，疯子的主题，写疯子这个主题是很多艺术里边很重要的专制国家艺术里面主题。疯子怎么歌唱啊？当然这里有个环境就是大雪天呐，我们的房檐前面吊着冰柱啊，冰寒冷啊，冰天雪地呀，万家磨面磨好来啊，敢有歌音动地啊呀！那个歌音是唱的什么歌呀？那个万家磨面是什么人呢？就是一个政治犯们。哎呀，他们死了，平了反了。平了反死了以后，那话也他们的儿女们也没法说话，没有看见。比方说虎风分子，很多人死了，他们的儿女哪去了？不知道，对吧？这些命运比我还悲惨呢，还悲惨多了呀。所以这么写这个，一看就写这个，用的音乐表现这个寒冷啊，寒风瑟瑟，冰冷冰柱啊，这冷感觉啊。那么在这个地方嘛，出现一种歌声，就是我想的疯子的歌。就这个意思啊，这是我脑子想象的一种这个，就是这个，悲哀的尽头了。对，疯子这种现象很可怕呀。我本人这个搞的这个半夜说胡话，就是我在80年，我和北京电视制片厂一个电影组一块工作呀，睡下觉了半夜说胡话，有一位导演跟我说：“哎呀，王旭林那个说胡话呀。”有环境，有人物，有情节，有场面，有气氛。我这文化圈说10几片连片说胡话呀，他们周围很多人看，好些人听着我半夜说胡话，这种局面，知道因为我80几了，慢慢才消失啊。我还知道有的人做噩梦啊，把人逼疯，这个非常可怕的事情，非常残酷的事情啊。
第3乐章，我听到你后面是用长笛奏出的这种凄厉的、欲哭无泪的这种压抑到极度的这种声音，所以我们中国人有一句老话说：“长歌当哭啊。”然后第4乐章，这是全曲的最后一部分，我听到您在这个乐章里边写的是人们重新聚集起来，拥到天安门广场。反抗生生不息呀！我们争自由、反极权的这种抗争还要艰难的继续。所以30多年来啊，香港同胞为纪念6·4殉难的死难者们，他们每一年都在维园点燃烛光，所以维园的6·4烛光之夜震撼了我们全体华人呢。但是现在极权统治毁灭了自由香港，今年的维园烛光可能再没有了，但是不屈的香港同胞，他们把烛光点燃到教堂里去。所以我看到了一个通知，就是在6·4之夜，香港的几个大的教堂 同时祭奠6·4的殉难者。这表明我们中国人争自由的决心，中国人争自由反极权的意志不可抵挡。所以我觉得任何极权都是压服不了我们的。那么因此第4乐章我的感受就是，王锡林老先生既回顾了2次天安门广场人们聚集的这个场面，同时又寄希望于未来中国人的继续力量重新组成一种抗争的大军，来为我们中国实现自由民主写出了他的呼声，写出了他的期待，也写出了我们所有人的心声。所以我觉得第4乐章是最有力量的一部分啊。所以请王锡林先生给我们介绍一下你第4乐章是怎么想的。
第4乐章是全曲的最后一个乐章了，这当然是要写人民重新聚集起来，是吧？反抗生生不息啊。这我就想起了这时候才需要写这个有2次这个人们冲击的镜头，前面3个乐章都没有写冲击奋斗啊。对，像这个4、5时候，1976年4、5时候那个小平头，对吧？在那边大喊叫喊，这个欲哭听鼓叫，欲哭听鼓叫，是我哭豺狼笑。说他是念诗啊，对，像那个镜头。还有在4、5时候，很多人在人民大会堂前面结成人仗冲锋那个形象啊。这4、5时候，这6、4时候更厉害了，人民从4面8方潮涌起来，风起云涌啊。所以我有很大场面写着动静啊，很长的篇幅写这个抗争，有涓涓细流从4面8方汇聚起来，汇成为强大的火山一般的爆发的力量。这时候我们有人起来讲演呼号，我有一个讲演的主题啊，对。这么一个主题，这样的，就2支元号吹了3次啊，这个就是呼号这么个场面哈，人山人海，这么一个力量这样的。但是嘛，就结尾怎么写呢？所有的听众们，艺术家不能够给人们以廉价的许诺，那种明亮，那种胜利结尾是虚假的，不能给出廉价的廉价的期望和胜利来骗人，对吧？所以我最后还是落在我这个第一乐章这个囚徒的主题上来去，一个命运的主题。那个命运的主题比悲剧主题比积极前进更有力量，对吧？就是准备好，不是一次就能斗争胜利的。果然，现在局面，中国历史有着大幅度的后退呀。对，我对这后退，我这个无可奈何，但是我音乐里写了，是吧？这个争取的胜利是不容易得来的。那么就是最后又回到这个集权里边来。现在这个作品就32年了，演出也是非常难的。
我们现在很多年轻人不知道32年前发生过这么一场震惊世界的屠杀，因为集权统治，他们在粉饰太平，他们在掩盖历史，他们在抹去这段真实的历史。
有2句话说，就是艺术家是干什么的？对，不是粉饰太平啊，艺术家要为老百姓说话。所以我把我的艺术思想啊，从我年轻时候到现在40、50年，我总结了一下，我简单的总结了几句话，在这向大家交流汇报啊。我认为历史的唯一品质是真实，但是真实并不美丽，而且很残酷，所以真实历史常常令人可畏而迫人讨论的。为了掩盖那并不美丽而且残酷的真历史，于是有了用谎言编成的假历史。假历史是美丽而甜蜜，常常令人可媚而亲昵啊。但是假历史不但有大美丽，而且还有大强力，它常常可以把真历史久久地驱走而取而代之。于是真历史就被久久地冰封在深水之下， 被埋藏在厚土之里，它在承受着永久的重压下，窒息着、沉默着、浓缩着、锻炼着，也验证着自己。真历史要取代假历史，常常比创造真历史还要付出沉重的代价。但是历史的真实一定会出来的。我的话就说这些，谢谢机会，谢谢给我的机会的。
所以我觉得您的这个交响乐极为的宝贵啊，它记录了这段真实的历史啊。
这个我也引用一个听众给我来了一封信说的话，有不认识的听众啊，他们说第三交响曲是中国民族的哭墙，像耶路撒冷一样。我很担不起这样的评价，但是我也能和我这样交流，我感到非常欣慰，非常欣慰啊。谢谢大家，谢谢大家听完的我这句话，希望大家能了解这部作品啊，谢谢大家。
让我们进入第三交响乐，借此缅怀逝去的生灵，借此凝聚所有反抗集权的力量，继续我们的抗争。好，请大家聆听第三交响乐。
谢。